Welcome to Life Stories. Tonight's story is one of courage, betrayal, and the unbreakable bond between a grandmother and her granddaughter. When Emily arrived at my doorstep in the dead of night, bruised, terrified, and pleading for help, I knew something was terribly wrong. What I uncovered shook me to my core. A secret arrangement, a family bound by control, and a girl desperate to escape a fate she never chose. How far would you go to protect someone you love? Stay with us as we uncover the truth. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's story with Life Stories. It was well past midnight when I heard the doorbell ring. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Who would be visiting at this hour? But then, the ringing came again, insistent this time, followed by loud, desperate knocking. I sat up abruptly, my heart pounding. A feeling of dread settled in my chest. No one comes unannounced to my house, especially not at this time of night. My first thought was that it might be an emergency, perhaps someone from the neighborhood needed help. Or maybe my husband, Thomas, had left something at his clinic, and a patient was trying to reach him. But then I heard it. "Grandma, please help me. Let me in." The voice was barely more than a broken sob. But I recognized it instantly. Emily. I nearly tripped over my own feet as I rushed toward the door. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the locks, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The moment I swung it open, Emily's body collapsed against me. She was shaking violently. Her long, golden hair was tangled, her face streaked with tears, and her once pristine school uniform was torn beyond recognition. The sight of her, my beautiful, bright 15-year-old granddaughter, reduced to this state nearly shattered me. One of her shoes was missing, and her stocking was ripped at the knee, exposing scraped, blooded skin. But what struck me the most were the bruises blooming across her face. One cheek was swollen, her lip split, and there were deep marks on her arms as if someone had grabbed her too roughly. I gasped, tightening my arms around her frail body. "Emily, sweetheart, what happened?" She clutched at my nightgown, her nails digging into the fabric as she sobbed into my shoulder. "He's coming," she whispered, her voice hoarse with terror. "Lock the door." I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door shut with a loud bang, bolting it immediately. Then I peered through the peephole. But the street outside was eerily quiet. Still, my instincts screamed at me to be cautious. "Who's coming?" I asked, brushing damp strands of hair from her tear-streaked face. She didn't answer. Instead, she just shook her head, squeezing her eyes shut as more tears spilled down her cheeks. Whatever had happened to her was far beyond anything I had ever imagined. I needed to get her out of this state, calm her down enough so she could talk to me. "Come inside, darling," I murmured, guiding her toward the living room. "You're safe now. No one will hurt you here." She hesitated, her frail body still trembling, before allowing me to lead her in. As we moved through the dimly lit hallway, I called out for my husband. "Thomas, get up. We need you." The urgency in my voice must have startled him, because within moments, he appeared at the top of the staircase, his graying hair disheveled from sleep. He took one look at Emily and immediately descended the steps, his doctor's instincts kicking in. "Oh my God," he breathed, kneeling beside her. "Emily, sweetheart, can you tell me where you're hurt?" She bit her lip, glancing at me as if seeking reassurance. I gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "It's okay, love," I encouraged. "You're safe here. Grandpa just wants to help." Slowly, she nodded. Thomas carefully examined her injuries, his experienced hands moving with the tenderness of a grandfather rather than just a physician. He asked simple questions, nothing too invasive. But it was clear that Emily wasn't ready to say much yet. "We need to take her to the hospital," he finally said, standing up. "Her injuries aren't life-threatening, but we need to be sure there's no internal damage." The word hospital made Emily stiffen. She shook her head furiously, panic flashing in her eyes. "No. No hospitals. I exchanged a worried glance with Thomas. If she was this afraid, whatever had happened must have been traumatic. I wasn't about to push her. Not when she was so fragile. All right, I said softly, stroking her hair. We won't go if you don't want to. But you need to rest. Sweetheart. Let Grandpa treat your wounds here. Okay. Emily hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. Thomas sighed but didn't argue. He disappeared into his study, returning moments later with his medical kit. As he cleaned her cuts and applied ointment to the bruises, I sat beside her, watching her face carefully. She still wouldn't look me in the eye. The Emily I knew was always poised, always composed. Even when she was younger, she never threw tantrums or raised her voice. She was intelligent, reserved, and graceful, the kind of girl who never let emotions get the best of her. But tonight, she was broken. Something inside me ached at the realization. Who had done this to my granddaughter? And why? As soon as Thomas finished, I wrapped Emily in a warm blanket and pulled her close. Can you tell me now, sweetheart? I whispered. What happened? She took a deep, shaky breath. But her voice cracked, and she buried her face in my shoulder instead. It's okay, I murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Take your time. For a long time, she didn't say anything. Then, finally, in a voice so small I almost didn't hear it, she whispered. They tried to give me away, Grandma. Like I was nothing. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Tried to give her away. I felt my stomach twist as a realization dawned. This was more than just a case of bullying or a simple teenage fight. Something much, much darker had happened to Emily, and I was going to get to the bottom of it. No matter what it took. I held Emily close, her small frame trembling in my arms. My heart ached for her. But I knew this was only the beginning. Whatever had driven her to flee in the dead of night, to arrive at my doorstep in such a pitiful state, was something far beyond the ordinary struggles of adolescence. She had said they tried to give her away. Those words sent a chill through me. I needed answers. But I couldn't push her, not yet. Instead, I just stroked her hair, whispering soothing words as she clung to me like a lost child. Thomas sat across from us, his brows furrowed in deep thought. I knew him well enough to see that he was already piecing together possibilities. But we needed the truth before we could act. After several minutes of silence, Emily finally spoke again, her voice hoarse from crying. They told me that I had no choice. I stiffened, my grip on her tightening. Who told you that, sweetheart? My parents, she whispered. Victoria and David. My son and daughter-in-law. For years, I had watched their marriage from the sidelines, silently worrying about the way things were. David had always been a quiet, bookish boy. But Victoria, oh, she was something else entirely. Coming from old money in Charleston, she had been raised in a world where appearances mattered more than anything. Her family, the Whitmores, prided themselves on their lineage, their influence, their carefully cultivated image of sophistication. From the moment she entered our lives, I knew she saw us as outsiders. I was never the kind of woman she could accept. A former athlete, a coach, someone who had spent years in a world of sweat, grit, and discipline. I was nothing like the women in her circles. The ones who played piano at charity galas and sipped wine in pristine sunrooms. She had tolerated me, for David's sake. But I had always felt her cold distance. Still, I never imagined she would do something like this. I pulled back slightly to study Emily's face. Tell me everything, sweetheart. From the beginning. She hesitated, glancing at Thomas as if afraid he would judge her. But he only gave her a gentle nod. You're safe here, Emily, he assured her. No one can hurt you now. She took a shaky breath. It started last week. My mother told me there was something important I needed to do for the family. I thought she meant some charity event. or another social gathering she wanted me to attend. But then she sat me down and told me the truth. My hands clenched into fists. But I forced myself to stay calm. They had arranged a marriage for me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Since I was born, it was always planned. I felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Thomas cursed under his breath, rubbing his temples. Arranged. Since she was born. This wasn't some sudden decision. This had been planned years ago, behind closed doors, while the rest of us were left in the dark. Emily swallowed hard. The man, his from my mother's family. The Whitmores. Their main branch. His name is Richard Montgomery. The name meant nothing to me, but from the way she said it, I knew it was someone much older. How old is he? Emily? I asked. My voice controlled but tight. She hesitated. Then, barely audible, she murmured, 47. My stomach churned. My granddaughter. A bright, talented, 15-year-old girl. And they wanted to hand her over to a man 3 times her age. I shot Thomas a glance. And his face was like stone. They took me to meet him. Emily continued, her voice hollow. A fancy restaurant. All candlelit and expensive. He smiled at me like he already owned me. My mother was so pleased. She kept telling me how lucky I was. She let out a humorless laugh. But there was only pain in it. I gritted my teeth. They took me to a hotel after that, she whispered. Told me I'd be spending the night with him. That it was important to start bonding. A sharp, visceral rage shot through me. And that's when I ran. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to remain composed. My hands, however, were shaking. Emily looked up at me then. Her eyes red but steady. I fought him off. Grandma. I swear. I kicked him and ran before he could do anything. I ran for hours until I got here. Pride swelled in my chest. Despite everything, she had fought back. But that didn't erase the fact that her own parents had done this to her. I glanced at Thomas. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought he might break a tooth. She's not going back there, he said firmly. I nodded. Not ever. Emily let out a long breath. Exhaustion evident in her every movement. I don't want to go back, she admitted. Her voice small. I brushed a tear from her cheek. You won't have to. But in my heart, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Emily fell asleep in my arms not long after her confession. Exhaustion finally overpowering the fear that had kept her upright. I sat there for a long time, holding her, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breath as she sank into much-needed rest. My mind, however, refused to be still. Beside me, Thomas was staring at nothing. His hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles were white. He wasn't the type to explode with anger. But I could see the fury simmering beneath his usually calm exterior. They tried to marry off our granddaughter, he said finally, his voice low and sharp, to a 47-year-old man. And David allowed it. I inhaled deeply, trying to steady myself. David didn't just allow it. I murmured. He accepted it as if it were normal. Thomas let out a slow breath, running a hand through his graying hair. I knew Victoria's family was obsessed with tradition. But this is something else. He was right. The Whitmores had always prided themselves on their control, their legacy, their perfectly curated social standing. Victoria had been raised to believe that women were assets, chess pieces to be positioned carefully for the family's benefit. I had always sensed it in the way she spoke about Emily's education, the way she micromanaged every aspect of her life. But I had never imagined it would lead to this. She was never meant to have a choice. I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Thomas exhaled sharply, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. What are we going to do, Margaret? It wasn't a question of whether we would act. That was a given. But how? I glanced down at Emily. Her fragile form curled against me, still clutching my nightgown as if I might disappear if she let go. A protective instinct surged through me so strong it nearly took my breath away. "We're going to fight for her," I said quietly. "No matter what it takes." Thomas nodded, his face set with determination. "Then we start by making sure she's safe." For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I stayed by Emily's side, watching over her, running my fingers through her hair like I used to when she was little. At some point, I pulled a blanket over both of us, and we sat there in the dim glow of the living room lamp, wrapped in warmth despite the storm brewing around us. By the time morning arrived, I had made up my mind. I wasn't just going to protect Emily, I was going to make them pay. I waited until the house was filled with the scent of fresh coffee before making my first move. Emily was still asleep, and Thomas had stepped outside to make a few phone calls. That left me alone with my thoughts and my next decision. I reached for my phone and dialed David's number. It rang, and rang, and rang, straight to voicemail. I gritted my teeth. Of course, he wouldn't pick up. Not after what had happened. So, I sent a message instead. "Margaret, I know what you and Victoria did. We need to talk. Now." No response. I set the phone down and took a slow sip of my coffee, forcing myself to remain calm. David had always been like this, passive, avoiding confrontation at all costs. He had spent his entire marriage bowing to Victoria's every demand, her every expectation. I had hoped, foolishly, that he would grow into his own strength once he became a father. But now I knew the truth. He had simply surrendered his daughter the same way he had surrendered himself. I glanced at the clock. If David wouldn't come to me, then I would go to him. An hour later, I was standing outside my son's house. The Whitmore estate was as pristine as ever. A massive, sprawling home with perfectly trimmed hedges and an iron gate that made it clear who was welcome and who wasn't. I didn't bother knocking. I rang the bell once, then pressed it again. Longer this time. I wasn't leaving until I got answers. A moment later, the door swung open. It wasn't David who greeted me. It was Victoria. She stood tall, her icy blue eyes scanning me with thinly veiled annoyance. Even now, she looked flawless, her silk blouse crisp, her makeup carefully applied, her posture as poised as ever. "Margaret," she said, her tone clipped. "I assume you're here about Emily." The casual way she said it, like this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, made my blood boil. I stepped forward, lowering my voice. "Where is my son?" She crossed her arms. "Busy." I let out a humorless laugh. "I'll bet." Her eyes narrowed. "You're upset. I understand that. But you need to look at this from a broader perspective. Margaret. This arrangement. Don't." I cut her off, my voice sharp. "Don't you dare try to justify what you did." Victoria tilted her head slightly, as if regarding a child who simply didn't understand the rules of the world. "I made a decision that was best for my daughter," she said smoothly. "For her future." I took another step forward, my pulse roaring in my ears. "You tried to sell your child," I hissed. Victoria's expression remained cool. "It was an arrangement, Margaret. Not some barbaric transaction. You wouldn't understand." "No," I said. "I wouldn't." A flicker of something, perhaps irritation, crossed her face. But it disappeared just as quickly. "I don't see what the point of this conversation is," she said. "Emily is coming back home. That's the end of it." I let out a slow breath, forcing down the fury bubbling inside me. "You think you're untouchable," I said quietly. "You always have. You think because your family has money, because you have influence, you can do whatever you want. But I have news for you, Victoria." I took another step closer, until I was looking her directly in the eye. "You made a mistake," I whispered. "You underestimated me." For the first time, her composure faltered. "Good. Because this was far from over." Victoria's lips pursed, the first real crack in her perfect mask. For a moment, she seemed to weigh her next words. calculating whether it was worth entertaining this conversation. I had known women like her my entire life. The kind who believed control was their birthright. That the world bent to their will simply because they willed it so. She had married my son. Convinced she could mold him into someone who fit into her family's legacy. And she had succeeded. David had become nothing more than an extension of the Whitmores, a silent, obedient son-in-law, content to live under their rule. But she had made one grave miscalculation. I was not David. Victoria exhaled, smoothing down the front of her silk blouse. Margaret. Let's be reasonable. Emily belongs with her family. She is with her family. I shot back. Victoria's nostrils flared. You know what I mean. We can make this all go away if you just bring her back. I let out a bitter laugh. Go away. You don't get to sweep this under the rug. Victoria. You tried to hand your own daughter over to a man 3 times her age. An established man, she corrected. As if that made it better. A man with influence. A man who could ensure her future. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You mean a man who could ensure your future? For a split second, I saw something flicker in her eyes, something dangerous. You think this was my decision? She asked, her voice dropping. You think I had a choice? That took me off guard. Excuse me? Victoria's expression darkened. A flicker of something almost like resentment flashing across her face. This was never about what I wanted. Margaret. You don't know what it's like to be part of this family, to be bound by expectations so tightly that you stop being a person and become a piece in their game. I narrowed my eyes. Are you saying you didn't want this marriage for Emily? Her jaw clenched. I wanted what was best for her. Just like I did when I married David. A hollow feeling settled in my chest. So that's what this is. I murmured. You sacrificed your own happiness. So now you expect Emily to do the same. Victoria's gaze sharpened. I built a life for her. A life of privilege. Of security. Not everyone gets choices. Margaret. Some of us have to make the decisions that no one else is willing to make. I stared at her, horrified. You were supposed to protect her. I am protecting her. No, you're controlling her. I snapped. Just like they controlled you. You act like you had no say. But you chose to do this to your own daughter. You became them. That landed. Victoria's face hardened. But she didn't deny it. Instead, she straightened, smoothing her expression back into its perfect, practiced calm. It doesn't matter what you think. Margaret. Emily will come back home. You can't keep her. I smiled. Slow and deliberate. Oh. But I can. Victoria blinked. Thrown off for the first time. She's 15. I continued. Old enough to decide where she wants to be. And she's already made that choice. Victoria's confidence faltered. I pressed on. And if you try to force her back, if you even think about making a move against her, I'll make sure the whole damn world knows what you've done. I let the words settle between us, watching as the color drained from her face. She knew what that meant. A scandal of this magnitude. The Whitmore name wouldn't just be tarnished, it would be ruined. Victoria swallowed. But she wasn't ready to surrender just yet. This isn't over, she whispered. No, I agreed. But it will be soon. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her standing there in her perfect house. With her perfect lies. And for the first time, I saw her for what she truly was. A woman trapped in a cage of her own making. But unlike Emily, she had chosen to lock the door. Emily never went back to that house. After that night, we took every legal measure possible to ensure her safety. With Thomas's connections and the undeniable evidence of what had been done to her, we built an impenetrable case. Victoria and David fought. Of course. But their power wasn't as absolute as they had believed. Their perfect reputation crumbled under the weight of their own cruelty. David lost his job. His once secure position, built on his in-laws' influence, slipped through his fingers as soon as the scandal broke. Victoria. once the poised and untouchable matriarch, became a pariah in the very social circles she had spent her life trying to control. The Whitmores distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with failure. As for Emily, she thrived. Living with us, she finally became the girl she was meant to be. She joined a martial arts gym, embracing the strength she had always longed for. The timid, fragile girl who had once tiptoed through life now stood tall, confident in her own skin. One evening, as she sparred with a partner at her gym, she grinned and called out, "Is that all you've got? Come at me harder." I watched from the sidelines, my heart swelling with pride. She was no longer afraid. Victoria was right about one thing: not everyone gets choices. But Emily had fought for hers. And she had won. And I would stand by her side. No matter what. Because family isn't about control. It's about love. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel for more powerful life stories. See you in the next video.